In the deepest reaches of space, where light struggles to penetrate the endless dark and civilizations rise and fall like distant stars, there exist artifacts so ancient and so sacred that their very discovery can reshape the fate of worlds. Some treasures are meant to remain buried, locked away in tombs of stone and silence, guarded by the weight of millennia and the sanctity of forgotten oaths. But the galaxy is vast, and chance cares nothing for the reverence of men or the will of emperors. Sometimes, the most terrible discoveries are made not by scholars or saints, but by those who understand nothing of what they have found, who see only scrap where others would see sacrilege, who find wonder in the wreckage of what should have remained forever sealed. This is a story about such a discovery. It is a tale of two forces that should never have met, two philosophies of warfare so fundamentally opposed that their intersection defies all reasonable probability. On one side stands the perfection of human achievement, the apex of genetic engineering and martial discipline, entombed in a walking shrine of archaeotech that even the mechanicus can barely comprehend. On the other side sprawls the crude vitality of the greenskins, those savage children of war who turn garbage into guns and belief into reality through sheer psychic willpower. When these two forces collide, when Ork hands grasp what was meant only for imperial reverence, the results are nothing short of catastrophic. Deep within a sector designated by imperial cartographers as the Ghoul Stars, a place where normal space bends strangely and the light of the Astronomicon flickers like a dying candle, there existed a world that had no name worthy of speaking. The Orks who had claimed it as their own simply called it Scrap World, which told you everything you needed to know about their approach to nomenclature. It was a planet-sized junkyard, a monument to the Ork philosophy of accumulation through violence. Centuries of raiding had transformed its surface into a landscape of twisted metal and broken dreams, where the bones of imperial cruisers jutted from the ground like the ribs of fallen titans, and the wreckage of 1,000 different civilizations lay rusting beneath acid rains. The Ork warband that ruled this world belonged to the Death Skulls clan, those blue-painted scavengers who elevated looting to an art form and believed with religious fervor that blue was the luckiest color in existence. Their war boss, a massive specimen named Scragnak the Looter, had built his power not through pure martial dominance like the Goths, or speed-obsessed aggression like the Evil Suns, but through the accumulation of the galaxy's finest scrap. His fortress, if it could be called such, rose from the planetary junk like a cathedral built by mad architects, composed entirely of looted parts from every imaginable source. It was on an otherwise unremarkable morning, beneath skies choked with the smoke of 1,000 forges and recycling furnaces, that a crew of Ork salvagers made their discovery. They had been digging through what appeared to be the remains of an ancient battlefield, one buried so deep beneath layers of subsequent debris that it must have dated back centuries, perhaps even millennia. The Orks, of course, cared nothing for archaeology or historical preservation. They were simply following the time-honored Death Skulls tradition of digging until you found something worth taking. The excavation crew consisted of about 30 Orks of various sizes, accompanied by twice that many Gretchen, who did most of the actual work, while their larger cousins supervised with characteristic brutality. They had been at it for 3 days, hauling out rusted weapons and corroded armor plates, when one of the Gretchen let out a squeal that cut through even the industrial cacophony of Scrap World. The little creature had broken through into what appeared to be a chamber, a space that had been sealed beneath the earth for longer than anyone could calculate. The Orks descended into the chamber with the subtlety of an avalanche, shoving Gretchen aside and widening the breach with power claws and enthusiastic violence. What they found within that buried space would have stolen the breath from any imperial citizen, would have brought even the most jaded inquisitor to their knees in reverent horror. To the Orks, it was simply the finest piece of scrap they had ever laid eyes upon. The chamber itself was small, barely large enough to contain what rested at its center. The walls were composed of a material that the Orks recognized as the same stuff the really tough Humi armor was made from, though this seemed older and harder than anything they had encountered before. Faint traces of gold leaf still clung to some surfaces, though most had flaked away over the centuries. And there, in the center of this forgotten tomb, stood a sarcophagus of such magnificent construction that even the Orks fell momentarily silent. It was a dreadnought, but not like any dreadnought the Orks had ever seen or fought. Where the Space Marine versions were bulky and functional, this machine possessed an elegance that spoke of craftsmanship elevated to religious devotion. Every plate of armor had been individually wrought, every joint engineered to perfection, every surface etched with inscriptions so small and precise that they were barely visible to the naked eye. The gold that covered it, though dulled by time and buried centuries, still caught what little light penetrated the chamber and threw it back in defiant glory. The machine stood roughly 12 feet tall, larger than a standard dreadnought, built on a scale that suggested its creators had been thinking in terms of permanence and power, rather than mere utility. Its arms, massive things that ended in weapons the Orks could not immediately identify, hung at its sides in a posture that could have been rest or could have been the stillness of death. The sarcophagus itself, the armored coffin that held whatever remained of the pilot, bore markings that an educated eye would have recognized as High Gothic script of an ancient dialect, prayers and oaths inscribed by master artisans who had poured their entire souls into their work. The Orks, of course, recognized none of this. What they saw was a massive, gold-plated killing machine that looked far more impressive than anything they currently possessed. The fact that it was not covered in the crude welding marks and random spikes that characterized Ork construction only made it more valuable in their eyes. This was proper loot, the kind of find that could make a mech boy's reputation and fill a war boss's trophy room with enviable pride. Skragnak arrived at the excavation site within the hour, drawn by the excited vox chatter of his boys and the promise of something truly special. The war boss was a towering specimen even by Ork standards, his blue-painted armor festooned with so many looted trophies and lucky charms that he clanked when he walked. He pushed through the crowd of Orks that had gathered around the chamber entrance, his personal retinue of knobs clearing a path with enthusiastic applications of violence, and descended into the buried tomb to see what all the fuss was about. When Skragnak laid eyes upon the golden dreadnought, his reaction was immediate and telling. His massive jaw dropped open, revealing tusks that had been capped with gold teeth looted from a dozen different sources. His eyes, small and cunning in his broad face, widened with an acquisitive gleam that would have been familiar to any merchant who had ever spotted an underpriced treasure. For a long moment, the war boss simply stood there, taking in every detail of the magnificent machine before him, his mind already racing through possibilities and plans. "Mine," Skragnak declared, his voice carrying the absolute authority of an Ork who had fought his way to the top and intended to stay there. "This is mine. Any git what says different gets to meet me claw, and we'll see who's still talking after that." The assembled Orks nodded their agreement, though more than a few eyes held the calculating look of Orks, who were already wondering if they might be able to challenge the boss for ownership of such a magnificent prize. But that was a problem for later. For now, there was the far more interesting question of how to actually claim this treasure, how to move it, and most importantly, how to make it work. Skragnak summoned his mech boys, those green-skin engineers whose instinctive understanding of technology bordered on the supernatural. Within hours, a dozen mechs of varying skill and specialization had gathered in the chamber, circling the golden dreadnought like scavengers around a corpse, each offering their expert opinion on what they had found and how it should be handled. Big Mech Grimzag, the most senior of Skragnak's engineering cadre, was the first to speak. He was an old Ork by greenskin standards, his skin a deep, weathered green, his mechanical augmentations speaking to decades of dangerous experimentation. He had seen more different types of technology than most Orks encountered in 3 lifetimes, had looted everything from Tau battlesuits to Eldar grav tanks, and his workshop was legendary throughout the warband for the barely controlled chaos of his creations. "Dis," Grimzag pronounced, running a claw along the Dreadnought's armor with surprising gentleness, "is proper gubbins, real proper. Ain't seen nothing like it, boss. It's Humy work, that's for sure, but it ain't regular Space Marine kit. This is something else, something fancy." The other mechs crowded closer, their mechanical appendages clicking and whirring as they examined their find from every angle. One produced a device that might have been a scanner, or might have been a random collection of parts held together with faith and wire. It buzzed and sparked as he waved it over the Dreadnought's surface, producing readings that meant nothing to anyone except the mech who wielded it. "It's still got juice in it," another mech announced, his voice carrying equal parts excitement and professional concern. "Some things ticking in there. Not dead, just sleeping maybe. Never seen a Humy walker that could sleep like this. Usually they're either on or they're scrap." This observation caused a stir among the assembled Orks. A still-functioning war machine, especially one this impressive, was worth more than its weight in scrap. If they could wake it up, if they could get it moving and fighting, the possibilities were extraordinary. Of course, there was also the small matter of what might happen when whatever was inside decided to wake up. But Orks have never been particularly good at thinking through potential consequences. The discussion that followed was loud, chaotic, and filled with the kind of technical jargon that would have baffled any non-mech who might have overheard it. Arguments erupted over the best way to proceed, with some mechs advocating for careful study, and others insisting they should just hit it with hammers until something happened. Skragnak listened to all of them, his small eyes moving from speaker to speaker, weighing options with the cunning that had kept him alive and in power for so many years. Finally, the war boss made his decision. "Right, here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna move this whole thing to the big workshop, where we got proper tools and space to work, and then we're gonna figure out how to make it work for us. Carefully, mind. Don't want to break nothing important. This ain't some pile of scrap we can just bash around. This is quality loot, and we're gonna treat it as such." The process of extracting the Dreadnought from its tomb and transporting it to Skragnak's main workshop took the better part of 2 days. The Orks, with uncharacteristic care, constructed a massive gantry crane from looted parts and used it to lift the golden machine from its resting place. Throughout the entire operation, the Dreadnought remained utterly still, showing no signs of life or awareness, a golden statue that might have been nothing more than an elaborate decoration for all the response it gave. But those with the right kind of sensors, or perhaps just the right kind of instinct, might have noticed something. Deep within the sarcophagus, in the armored heart of the machine where flesh met metal and consciousness dwelt in twilight between life and death, something stirred. Not movement, not yet, but the faintest flutter of awareness, like the first breath after a long sleep. Centuries of dormancy were beginning, ever so slowly, to lift. The warrior within was starting to remember what it meant to be awake, to understand what the Orks had truly found, to comprehend the magnitude of their discovery and the danger they had unwittingly brought into their midst. One must first understand what a Custodian Dreadnought actually is. These are not mere war machines, not simple tools of destruction like the Dreadnoughts that serve the Space Marine chapters across the Imperium. A Custodian Dreadnought represents something far more significant, far more terrible, and infinitely more sacred. The Adeptus Custodes, known throughout Imperial history as the Emperor's own bodyguard, the 10,000, the Watchers of the Throne, are beings who exist at the absolute apex of human genetic engineering. Where Space Marines are created in batches, their gene seed harvested and implanted according to relatively standardized procedures, each Custodian is a unique work of art. The Emperor himself, in the days before his internment upon the Golden Throne, personally oversaw the creation of every single member of his personal guard. Each warrior was individually designed, their genetic code handcrafted to produce not just a soldier, but a masterpiece of human potential. These golden warriors stand head and shoulders above even the legendary Space Marines, both literally and figuratively. Where a Space Marine is created to be a soldier, A Custodian is created to be perfection incarnate. Their reflexes operate at speeds that make them appear to move in slow motion to baseline humans. Their strength is sufficient to tear armored bulkheads from their moorings with their bare hands. Their minds possess tactical acuity that can process and respond to threats before most warriors even recognize danger exists. They are scholars and philosophers as much as they are warriors, each one educated in multiple disciplines, capable of conversing on subjects ranging from ancient history to theoretical physics to the finest points of sword technique. For such beings, death in battle is vanishingly rare. The combination of their incredible abilities, their mastercrafted equipment, and their centuries of training and experience makes them nearly unstoppable on any battlefield. When enemies do manage to wound a Custodian, their enhanced physiology and the immediate attention of the Emperor's finest apothecaries typically ensures full recovery. These warriors are too valuable, too perfectly crafted, too essential to the Emperor's vision to allow simple injury to end their service. But sometimes, rarely, something happens that is so catastrophic, so utterly destructive, that even a Custodian's incredible body cannot recover. Perhaps a weapon of terrible power catches them unawares. Perhaps they sacrifice themselves to save their Emperor or their brothers, throwing themselves into harm's way with the knowledge that survival is impossible. Perhaps the battle is so intense, the enemy so overwhelming, that even perfection is not enough. In these rare moments, when a Custodian falls, with his duty unfulfilled and his mind still sharp despite his body's ruin, a terrible choice presents itself. For any other warrior, death would be the obvious end. But Custodians do not die easily, and their sense of duty transcends any concern for personal comfort or peace. The vow they swear upon their creation is absolute and eternal. Only in death does duty end, the saying goes. And for a Custodian, even mortal injury does not necessarily constitute death. If the warrior's mind remains intact, if his will to serve burns bright enough, if his skills and knowledge are deemed too valuable to lose, then he may choose a fate that many would consider worse than death itself. He may choose internment within a Dreadnought. The Dreadnoughts of the Legio Custodes are not mass-produced. Each one is a unique creation, handcrafted by the finest artificers of the Mechanicus, working under the direct supervision of the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes. These machines are works of art that happen to be engines of war, or perhaps engines of war that happen to be works of art. The distinction becomes meaningless when confronted with the reality of their construction. During the Great Crusade and the Horus Heresy, when the Custodians fought openly across the stars, rather than standing eternal vigil over the Emperor's throne, 3 primary patterns of Custodian Dreadnought were employed. Each represented the pinnacle of archaeotech, incorporating technology that the Mechanicus of the 41st Millennium can maintain, but no longer fully understands or replicates. The Contemptor Achilles was the most common, if such a word can be applied to machines that never numbered more than a few dozen across the entire Imperium. This pattern combined phenomenal strength with surprising speed, creating a war machine that could match the interred Custodian's own legendary combat abilities. Armed with the mighty Dread Spear, a weapon modeled after the Guardian spears carried by standard Custodians, but enlarged to match the Dreadnought's scale, the Achilles excelled at both ranged and close combat. The Dread Spear incorporated a Corvus pattern las pulsar at its tip, allowing the Achilles to strike with precision at range, before closing to impale enemies with a weapon that combined the best aspects of a power weapon and a las weapon in a single devastating package. The Contemptor Galatus pattern, meanwhile, served a different role. Where the Achilles was a general-purpose battle unit, the Galatus was built for defense and close assault. It wielded the Galatus Warblade, a massive power weapon designed for sweeping strikes that could cleave through multiple enemies with each blow. The built-in flamer allowed it to purge infantry at close range, while the Presidium shield it carried provided protection that could turn aside even the heaviest weapons. Galatas pattern. Dreadnoughts often served as bodyguards for important imperial officials or as anchor points in defensive positions, their incredible durability allowing them to hold ground that would have been untenable for any other unit. But the Telemon Heavy Dreadnought represented something else entirely. These machines were the largest, most powerful dreadnoughts ever created for the Custodians, so massive and so heavily armed that they dwarfed even the Contemptor patterns. Only a handful were ever built, each one reserved for the most celebrated warriors, those whose tactical genius and martial skill were deemed worthy of preservation in such a magnificent engine of destruction. A Telemon could carry weapons ranging from Arachnos storm cannons to Iliastus accelerator culverins to the massive Telemon Saisti power fists with built-in plasma projectors. The back-mounted spiculous bolt launcher provided additional firepower, creating a mobile weapons platform that could engage everything from infantry to armored vehicles to enemy war machines with equal effectiveness. All of these patterns shared certain characteristics that set them apart from the dreadnoughts employed by the Space Marines. Where Marine dreadnoughts were functional and durable, Custodian dreadnoughts were sublime. Every component was handcrafted to tolerances measured in microns. The armor was not merely thick, but was layered in complex patterns that redirected energy and dispersed impacts with maximum efficiency. Atomantic shields, force fields that could dispel laser blasts and deflect artillery shells through localized manipulation of reality itself, provided protection that made the dreadnoughts nearly invulnerable to conventional weapons. Most importantly, the interface between the pilot and the machine was far more sophisticated than anything used in standard dreadnought construction. The Mechanicus employed every scrap of Dark Age technology they could muster to create a connection that allowed the Custodian to move the dreadnought as naturally as he had once moved his own body. The machine became an extension of the warrior's will, responding to thought as quickly as flesh had once responded, preserving the legendary combat abilities that had defined the Custodian in life. But for all their technological magnificence, these machines could not escape the fundamental horror of what they represented. A Custodian dreadnought is a tomb for the living, a coffin that walks and fights but never releases its occupant. The warrior within has been reduced to his most basic components. His body, broken beyond any hope of natural recovery, has been stripped away piece by piece until only the essential organs and the brain remain. These biological fragments float in an amniotic tank sustained by arcane life support systems, fed with nutrients, kept alive through methods that blur the line between medicine and dark sorcery. The pilot exists in a state of constant twilight, neither fully alive nor completely dead. For most Custodians, the internment is permanent. Once sealed within the dreadnought, they will remain there until the machine is destroyed in battle, or until the biological components finally fail from age or accumulated damage. Some Custodian dreadnoughts have served for centuries, their pilots growing increasingly distant from the humanity they once possessed, their personalities gradually subsumed into the machine until they become more walking weapon than living being. This is the sacrifice they make, the price they pay for continued service. For a Custodian, whose entire existence has been built around duty and perfection, the loss of their physical form is a tragedy beyond measure. These warriors were created to be perfect, to embody the Emperor's vision of what humanity could become, to be reduced to a few pounds of organs in a tank, to move through the world encased in metal rather than feeling the sun on golden skin, to never again know the simple pleasures of existence outside a walking sarcophagus. This is a fate that even the most dedicated warrior must find difficult to bear. And yet, they endure, because they are Custodians, and for them, duty is everything. The vow they swore still binds them. The Emperor they serve still needs their protection. The Imperium they helped build still requires their strength. so they accept their new existence, they master their mechanical forms, and they continue to fight with the same skill and determination they showed when they walked as men rather than as machines. The process of internment itself is a ritual of tremendous gravity. When a custodian is so grievously wounded that even their enhanced physiology cannot save them, the decision to entomb them is made by the Captain General himself. No one else has the authority to order such a transformation. The wounded custodian must also consent. No warrior is forced into a dreadnought against their will, for the custodians understand that this choice represents a sacrifice that must be made freely to have any meaning. Once the decision is made, the finest tech priests and apothecaries in the Imperium gather to perform the procedure. It can take days or even weeks, depending on the extent of the injuries and the delicate nature of the work required. Damaged tissue must be carefully removed. Essential organs must be isolated and prepared for their new existence. The neural connections must be precisely established, each synapse mapped and linked to the machine's control systems. Throughout this entire process, the custodian remains conscious, fully aware of what is being done to him, experiencing every moment of his transformation from man into machine. The pain, by all accounts, is extraordinary, but custodians are trained from childhood to master pain, to accept suffering as simply another sensation to be acknowledged and controlled. They observe their own transformation with clinical detachment, sometimes even offering suggestions to the tech priests based on their own extensive understanding of anatomy and technology. It is said that some custodians recite the entirety of their service record during the procedure, speaking for hours without pause, their voices never wavering despite what is being done to their bodies. When the internment is complete, when the last connection has been made and the sarcophagus sealed, the custodian undergoes a period of adjustment. He must learn to see through optical sensors rather than eyes, to speak through vox casters rather than vocal cords, to move limbs of adamantium and ceramite rather than muscle and bone. For beings whose entire identity has been built around physical perfection, this adjustment can be psychologically devastating. Some never fully adapt, remaining forever trapped between their memories of what they were and the reality of what they have become. But most, eventually, find their way. They learn to accept their new existence, to find satisfaction in continued service, even if the form of that service has changed. They become legends within the custodian guard, ancient warriors whose experience spans centuries, whose counsel is sought by their still human brothers, whose mere presence on a battlefield can turn the tide of conflicts that would otherwise be lost. They stand as living proof that duty truly does transcend death, that service to the Emperor need not end even when the body fails. It is worth noting that there are tales, unverified but persistent, of custodians volunteering for dreadnought duty, even when they have not been mortally wounded. Some of these volunteers were preparing to leave Terra as eyes of the Emperor, agents sent out into the galaxy to observe and report on threats that might require the custodian's attention. Others felt they had failed in some fundamental duty and sought the eternal penance of internment. Still others simply believed that a dreadnought's pilot had been killed and that the machine was too valuable to remain empty, so they sacrificed themselves to ensure it could continue fighting. These volunteers face judgment from the Captain General, who must determine whether their request stems from genuine dedication or from some psychological flaw that would make them unsuitable for such a permanent commitment. Not all requests are granted, but for those who are accepted, the process is the same. They surrender their bodies willingly, trading flesh for metal, accepting a living death in service to the throne. Now, understanding all of this, understanding what a custodian dreadnought truly represents, we can begin to appreciate the magnitude of what the Orks had discovered in that buried tomb. They had found not merely a sophisticated war machine, though it was certainly that. They had not simply stumbled upon an example of lost technology, though such technology did indeed rest within that golden shell. What they had found was a shrine, a sacred trust, a warrior of such legendary skill and dedication that even death could not release him from service. And more than that, they had found a being who was still aware, still conscious, still capable of wrath. The Dreadnought that now stood in Scragnak's workshop, surrounded by chattering mech boys and curious orcs, had been sleeping for so long that even he could not have said precisely how many centuries had passed. His last clear memory was of a battle, though the specifics had grown hazy during his long dormancy. There had been enemies, he remembered that much, many enemies. The specifics of their nature had faded, but the sensation of fighting them remained vivid. He remembered the weight of his dread spear, the satisfying impact as it crushed armor and pulverized flesh. He remembered the screaming of his weapons, the thunder of his footfalls, the glory of service rendered to the Emperor. And then, darkness, not death, for death would have been final. This was something else, a state of suspended animation that preserved consciousness without allowing for actual awareness. He had drifted in that darkness, untethered from time, his mind occasionally surfacing just enough to recognize that he still existed before, sinking back into the void. How long had he slumbered? He had no way of knowing. His chronometers, if they still functioned, could not be accessed while his systems remained in this minimal power state. Days might have passed, or years, or millennia. Without external input, without the ability to sense the passage of time, he existed in an eternal present that stretched backward and forward into infinity. But something was changing. The darkness that had cradled him for so long was growing less complete. Sensations, faint and indistinct, began to filter through the fog of dormancy. Vibrations transmitted through his chassis. The sense of movement, though he himself was not moving. Pressure changes, temperature fluctuations, the kinds of environmental data that his machine body collected automatically and fed to his consciousness, whether he willed it or not. Someone or something was handling him, moving him. The realization cut through the darkness like a blade, bringing with it the first true stirrings of awakening. His consciousness, dormant for so long, began to claw its way back toward awareness, driven by training and instinct that transcended sleep. A custodian does not rest easy when in the presence of potential threats. Danger demands vigilance, and something deep within him recognized that his current situation was very wrong indeed. Memory began to reassert itself, though slowly and incompletely. He was a custodian. That much he knew with absolute certainty. The knowledge was written into every aspect of his being, encoded at such a fundamental level that not even death could erase it. He had served the Emperor, had fought in his name, had stood vigil over the throne and defended it against threats that would have broken lesser beings. He remembered gold, lots of gold, the color that defined everything he had been. He remembered brothers whose names had faded but whose presence remained vivid in his emotional memory. And he remembered the decision, the choice he had made when his body had failed, but his will had not. He had accepted internment, had allowed himself to be sealed within this walking tomb because duty demanded it, and duty was everything. He was Dreadnought now, no longer merely a warrior, but a warrior merged with a war machine, his consciousness preserved in metal and ceramite so that his service might continue. But something was very wrong. The sensations filtering through to his slowly waking mind did not match what they should be. He should be in the vaults beneath the Imperial Palace, or perhaps in a strike cruiser if he had been awakened for a campaign. He should be surrounded by the familiar hum of Imperial technology, by the voices of his brothers, or the chanting of tech priests. Instead, he heard sounds that were alien and harsh, voices speaking a language that his transhuman mind identified after a moment of processing as Orkish. Orkish. The realization sent a spike of alarm through his consciousness. If he was hearing Orks, then his situation was far more dire than mere disorientation. The Greenskins were Xeno's scum, subhuman filth that the Imperium had fought since time immemorial. They had no business being anywhere near a Custodian Dreadnought. The fact that he could hear them meant either he was on some battlefield where Orks were the enemy, or, far worse, he was somehow in Ork hands. He tried to move, to activate his systems and bring himself to full combat readiness, but his body, if the Dreadnought could be called that, did not respond. His power systems remained dormant, his weapons offline, his limbs locked in whatever position they had been placed. He could sense his surroundings only dimly, through the passive sensors that required no active power to function. It was like being paralyzed, trapped within his own body, aware but helpless. Panic, that most un-Custodian-like emotion, began to creep in at the edges of his consciousness. He was a warrior bred and trained to face any threat without fear, but this situation was outside his experience. He had been prepared for death in battle, for glorious sacrifice in service to the Emperor. He had accepted the half-life of Dreadnought internment, the twilight existence between flesh and machine. But to be helpless, to be aware but unable to act, to know that enemies surrounded him while he could do nothing to defend himself or strike back. This was a horror he had never contemplated. He forced the panic down through sheer force of will. Custodians did not panic. They assessed, they planned, they acted with perfect efficiency even in the most dire circumstances. So he would do what he had been trained to do. He would gather information. He would wait. He would prepare. And when the opportunity came, when his systems finally came online and allowed him to act, he would show these Xenos exactly what it meant to have captured a Custodian. The Orks, meanwhile, were conducting their examination with all the delicacy and care one might expect from a species that considered careful to mean only breaking most things instead of all things. Grimzag and his team of mech boys had set up shop around the Dreadnought, transforming a section of Scragnak's workshop into an impromptu surgical theatre where the patient was a several-ton war machine and the surgeons were greenskins whose idea of precision work involved hammers and guesswork in equal measure. To their credit, the mechs were being as cautious as Orks were capable of being. They understood that they had found something special, something that required more thought than the usual Orkish approach of hitting things until they worked or broke entirely. Grimzag had insisted on actually studying the machine before they started trying to modify it, a position so radical among Ork engineers that it had nearly resulted in a fistfight with the younger, more impetuous mechs who wanted to start welding spikes and guns onto it immediately. The examination revealed details that both excited and confused the assembled mech boys. The Dreadnought's construction was unlike anything they had encountered before. Where Ork technology was characterized by crude welds and obvious rivets, held together by a combination of barely adequate engineering and the psychic willpower of the collective Gestalt field, this machine was assembled with such precision that the joins between components were almost invisible. Every part fit together with micrometer accuracy, creating seals that would have made a Mechanicus tech priest weep with envy. The armor plating proved particularly fascinating to the mechs. It was not merely thick, though it was certainly that, with some sections measuring several inches of solid ceramite. It was also layered in ways that suggested a deep understanding of how energy and kinetic impacts could be dispersed and redirected. When one of the younger mechs hit a section with a power claw, just to test its strength, the weapon bounced off without leaving so much as a scratch, while the mech himself was thrown backward by the recoil. The armor, somehow, had turned the energy of the blow back against the attacker. "They got force field gubbins built into the armor," Grimzag muttered, running his claws over the surface with newfound respect. "Sneaky humies. Course they would. Can't just make something strong, gotta make it smart too. That's the Humie way." The weapons mounted on the Dreadnought's arms presented another puzzle. One arm ended in what appeared to be a massive spear, though unlike any spear the Orks had ever seen. It was as long as an Ork was tall, its tip gleaming with the characteristic sheen of a power weapon, while complex machinery built into the shaft suggested it was also some kind of gun. The mechs spent an hour just trying to figure out how the thing worked, arguing among themselves about whether it shot las bolts or plasma, or something else entirely. The other arm terminated in a massive fist, fingers curled into a permanent grasping position, clearly designed to crush and tear anything unfortunate enough to be caught in its grip. But this too was no simple close combat weapon. Even in its dormant state, the mechs could see the energy field generators built into the fingers, the complex mechanical systems that would allow it to grasp with enough force to pulverize tank armor. And there were what appeared to be weapon mounts on the back of the hand, though what they might fire remained a mystery. But it was the sarcophagus itself, the armored coffin at the machine's heart, that truly captured the mech's attention. They could sense, with that peculiar instinct that all mech boys possessed, that this was the core of the whole thing, the control center from which the machine would be operated. If they could crack it open, if they could see what made it work, they might be able to understand how to activate the Dreadnought and, more importantly, how to control it. "Right den," Grimzag announced, after hours of examination and debate. "We knows what we gotta do. We gotta get into the sarcophagus, what's it, see what's ticking in there. Once we know how it works, we can figure out how to wake it up and make it do what we want." This pronouncement was met with general agreement from the assembled mechs, along with the kind of enthusiastic anticipation that Orks displayed when they were about to do something potentially very dangerous. Several of them immediately began suggesting tools they might use to open the sarcophagus, ranging from cutting torches to massive power claws to simply hitting it with really big hammers until something gave way. Grimzag, however, surprised everyone by counseling patience. "Nah, we ain't just gonna smash our way in. Look at this thing, look at how it's made. Every bit is connected to every other bit. We start cutting without knowing what we're cutting. We might break something important, and if we break something important in dispute, I'll personally feed whoever done it to the squigs." Instead, the big mech advocated for a more methodical approach. They would study the sarcophagus's seals, looking for access panels or maintenance hatches that the original builders had presumably included. They would trace the power conduits and data lines, mapping out how the machine's systems interconnected. And only when they understood the layout, only when they had some idea of what they might find inside, would they attempt to actually open it. This level of caution was nearly unprecedented for Ork engineering, and it spoke to just how seriously Grimzag was taking this project. The old mech had been around long enough to know that sometimes the best loot was also the trickiest loot, and rushing into things without thinking was a good way to end up with a pile of worthless scrap instead of a functioning war machine. So, the mechs began their careful examination, and in doing so, they committed a fatal error. In their focus on the mechanics, on the physical components and technological systems, they had completely failed to consider the most important aspect of the Dreadnought. They were so busy treating it as a machine that they had forgotten, or perhaps never realized, that it was also a tomb, and the dead, sometimes, do not rest quietly. Within the sarcophagus, the Custodian's awareness continued to sharpen. He could now hear voices with greater clarity, could pass meaning from the guttural Orkish language that surrounded him. The Greenskins were planning to open his sarcophagus. They wanted to study him, to understand how he worked, to make him serve them. The presumption, the sheer audacity of these Xenos filth, thinking they could claim a Custodian for their own purposes, sparked a fury that cut through the last lingering fog of dormancy like a blade through silk. Fury was not an emotion that Custodians typically indulged. They were trained from childhood to be above such things, to act from calculation and duty rather than passion. But there were limits to any being's capacity for restraint, and the Custodian found that he had reached his. These Orks, these crude and savage aliens, dared to lay their hands upon him, dared to discuss him as if he were some tool to be claimed and used, dared to treat a warrior of the Emperor as loot to be divided among scavengers. The fury served a purpose, though. It burned away the last vestiges of dormancy, focusing his consciousness into a sharp and terrible clarity. He began to take stock of his situation with the methodical precision that had been drilled into him through centuries of training and experience. His power systems were offline, yes, but they were not destroyed. If he could find a way to activate them, if he could bring his reactor online, then he would have options. His weapons would function, his limbs would respond. He could fight, and fighting was something he understood with perfect clarity. But first, he needed to understand his surroundings better. He needed information about where he was, how many orcs there were, what resources they might have that could threaten him even after he awakened. So he listened, passing the orcish conversations with the linguistic skills that all custodians possessed. And slowly, piece by piece, he began to build a picture of his situation. He was in a workshop. That much became clear. The orcs spoke of Big Mech Grimzag and War Boss Scragnak, names that meant nothing to him, but which clearly denoted positions of authority. From their discussions, he learned that he had been found in some kind of buried chamber, excavated from deep beneath the surface of whatever world this was. The orcs seemed to think he was inactive, just a particularly well-made piece of scrap. They had no idea that consciousness stirred within the metal shell they were so casually examining. This gave him an advantage. If they thought him inert, they would not be prepared for him to suddenly awaken. They would have their defenses lowered, their attention focused on trying to understand his systems rather than on defending themselves against those systems. When he made his move, when he finally managed to bring himself online, the surprise would be total and the slaughter would be glorious. But he needed to time it carefully. Awakening too soon, before his systems were fully powered and functional, would leave him vulnerable. The orcs might be crude and stupid, but they were also numerous and enthusiastic about violence. If he came online before he could effectively defend himself, they might overwhelm him through sheer weight of numbers. Better to wait, to endure this indignity a while longer, until the perfect moment presented itself. So he waited, and he listened, and he planned. And deep within his mechanical heart, where the fury burned hottest, he made a vow. These orcs would pay for their presumption. Every single one of them would learn what it meant to have offended a custodian. He would paint this workshop with their blood. He would reduce their bodies to component atoms. He would make such an example of them that the memory of their destruction would echo through orc legend for generations. But first, he needed them to make a mistake. The mistake came on the third day of examination, when Grimzag finally found what he believed to be the primary access panel to the sarcophagus's interior systems. It was hidden beneath a decorative plate, disguised so cleverly that it had taken hours of careful study to locate. The panel itself was secured with locks that the mech could not immediately understand, complex mechanisms that combined physical security with what appeared to be some kind of electronic authentication system. Grimzag, being an orc and therefore constitutionally incapable of leaving well enough alone, decided that the best way to deal with locks he couldn't understand was to simply bypass them entirely. He produced a plasma cutter, a tool he had looted from a Tau battlesuit, and then modified with typical orc disregard for safety or efficiency. The weapon hissed to life, spewing a stream of superheated gas that could cut through most materials with ease. "Right den," the big mech muttered, adjusting the cutter's focus. "Let's see what's inside this thing." He brought the plasma cutter down toward the access panel's edge, intending to simply cut through the locks rather than figuring out how to properly open them. The superheated plasma touched the edge of the panel, and for a moment, everything seemed to proceed normally. Metal began to glow, started to soften and run. Then, with a speed that caught everyone by surprise, the Dreadnought systems activated. Not fully, not all at once, but enough. The reactor, dormant for so long, suddenly roared to life, flooding the machine with power. Emergency protocols, triggered by the detection of unauthorized access attempts, kicked in automatically. Defensive systems that had been sleeping sprang awake with the sole purpose of protecting the Dreadnought from whatever was trying to violate its integrity. The first indication the orcs had that something was very wrong was when the Dreadnought's optical sensors suddenly blazed to life, bathing the workshop in harsh golden light. Then, a fraction of a second later, the machine's voxcasters activated, and a voice that had not spoken in centuries filled the air. It was not a human voice, not really. The Dreadnought's vocal systems transformed speech into something deeper, more resonant, more terrible. It carried the weight of authority that came from absolute certainty of purpose. The kind of voice that expected to be obeyed not because it was loud, but because disobedience was fundamentally inconceivable. "Xeno scum!" the voice boomed, each word striking like a physical blow. "You dare to defile a warrior of the Emperor!" The Orks, to their credit, recovered from their surprise with the typical greenskin speed. Grimzag dropped his plasma cutter and dove for cover behind a pile of scrap. Other mechs scrambled for weapons, while those Orks who had been standing guard around the workshop suddenly found themselves facing a war machine that had gone from inert decoration to active threat in the span of a single heartbeat. The Custodian, now fully awake and absolutely livid, assessed his tactical situation in microseconds. His weapon systems were powered, but not yet at full effectiveness. His legs remained locked in place, either due to some safety protocol or simply because the joints needed time to warm up after their long dormancy. But his arms, those massive limbs designed to wield weapons that could shatter tanks, those had mobility. He moved, and the Orks scattered like vermin before a fire. His left arm, the one mounting the dread spear, swept through the space where Grimzag had been standing a moment before, the weapon's powered tip leaving, glowing trails in the air. It missed the big mech by inches, instead striking a workbench and reducing it to splinters. Tools and components went flying, adding to the chaos that had erupted in the workshop. His right arm, the power fist, clenched and unclenched as he tested its functionality. The crushing force it could generate was formidable, but without full mobility, he could not bring it to bear on targets that had the sense to stay out of reach. He needed his legs to function. He needed to be able to move, to pursue, to bring his full combat capabilities to bear. "Stand and face your judgment," he roared, his voice carrying across the workshop and likely beyond, into the greater complex of Skragnak's fortress. "You have defiled what was sacred. Your deaths will be absolute." The Orks, however, had other ideas about how this should proceed. Grimzag, from his position behind cover, shouted orders to the other mechs. "Shut it down! Hit the power couplings! Don't let it get fully! Online!" Several brave or foolish Orks charged forward, wielding power claws and heavy wrenches, aiming for the conduits and cables that connected the Dreadnought to the workshop's power supply. They were operating under the assumption that the machine needed external power to function, that cutting those connections would render it harmless again. They were wrong. The Dreadnought's reactor was self-contained, designed to operate for decades or even centuries without external input. The workshop's power connections were merely conveniences, ways to keep the machine topped off while in storage. Severing them would do nothing to stop the awakened warrior from wreaking vengeance on his captors. The Custodian demonstrated this fact by swatting one of the charging Orks with his power fist. The greenskin, a relatively small specimen barely 7 feet tall, caught the blow full in the chest. The impact was like watching what happens when an artillery shell hits an unarmored target. The Ork simply disintegrated, reduced to a spray of blood and pulverized bone that painted the nearby walls in a grotesque pattern. The other Orks, seeing the fate of their comrade, wisely reconsidered their approach. But they were Orks, and Orks do not retreat easily. Instead of fleeing, they began to coordinate their attacks, working together with unusual efficiency to try to overwhelm the Dreadnought through numbers and persistence. Shots rang out as those Orks with guns opened fire. Slugger rounds and heavy stubber fire raked across the Dreadnought's armor, creating a deafening cacophony, but doing absolutely no damage. The armor that had been designed to shrug off Lascanon fire and melter blasts was not even scratched by conventional small arms. The impacts did, however, serve to further enrage the Custodian, who took each hit as a renewed insult to his dignity. Meanwhile, the Dreadnought was conducting his own assessment of the situation. His weapons were powering up nicely, the Pong. Dreadspear's last pulsar was charging, building toward the threshold where it could fire. His power fist's energy fields were stabilizing, reaching the levels where they could be used not just to crush, but to disintegrate anything they touched. And finally, blessedly, he felt his leg servos beginning to unlock. Movement. The ability to pursue. This changed everything. The first step the Dreadnought took was tentative, testing systems that had been dormant for centuries. Servos whined. Joints that had been locked in place for longer than most humans lived protested at being asked to work again. But they held. The Dreadnought lurched forward, taking that first stumbling step like a child learning to walk. The second step was more confident. His systems were adapting quickly, the machine's spirit remembering how to move, responding to the Custodian's will with increasing fluidity. By the third step, he was advancing with the terrible purpose that had defined his entire existence. He was a Custodian, perfect in all things, and movement was one of the first skills he had mastered in his original body. The Dreadnought was simply a different body, but the principles remained the same. Weight, balance, momentum, timing, all of it came together in his transhuman mind, allowing him to move with a grace that should have been impossible for something so massive. The Orks, seeing that their opponent was now mobile, realized they had a serious problem. Grimzag was screaming orders, trying to organize a coherent defense, but coordination was never the Orks' strong suit. Some were still trying to shoot the Dreadnought, their weapons having no effect. Others were attempting to flee, recognizing that they were hopelessly outmatched. Still others, driven by the inherent Orkish belief that if you just hit something hard enough, it would eventually break, were charging forward with power claws and hammers. The Custodian allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction as he began to truly fight for the first time in centuries. His dreadspear lashed out, the powered blade slicing through an Ork with such force that it continued through and killed the Ork behind him as well. The last pulsar fired, a beam of concentrated light that burned a hole clean through a third Ork's torso. His power fist reached out and grabbed a fourth, the energy fields crackling as they reduced the unfortunate greenskin to ash. It was glorious. It was righteous. It was everything he had been created to do. But it was also woefully inadequate. Because even as he killed Ork after Ork, even as he demonstrated the vast gulf in capability between a Custodian and mere Xenos filth, he could feel his systems beginning to struggle. Centuries of dormancy had taken their toll. His reactor was running at full power, yes, but it was also running hot, hotter than it should be. Warning indicators that he had learned to interpret over his long service were lighting up across his internal displays. His weapons were performing admirably, but he could sense inefficiencies in their operation, small flaws in performance that suggested components were degrading. And most concerning of all, there were more Orks coming. He could hear them in the corridors beyond the workshop, alerted by the commotion, rushing to see what all the excitement was about. Dozens of them, perhaps hundreds. The Orks bred like vermin, and he was alone in what was clearly their stronghold. The tactical assessment was clear and brutal. He could not win this fight. Not in his current condition, not against these numbers. Every Ork he killed was replaced by 3 more. For every weapon he destroyed, the Greenskins had 10 more. He was one warrior, no matter how perfect, no matter how skilled, against an entire warband. But Custodians did not surrender. They did not retreat. They fought until duty was fulfilled, or until death released them from their obligations. So he would fight, and he would kill. And when his systems finally failed and the Orks tore him apart, he would die, knowing that he had made them pay dearly for the privilege of ending him. He waded forward into the oncoming horde, his weapons singing their song of destruction, his battle cry echoing through the workshop and beyond. Behind him, he left a trail of broken Orks and devastated equipment. Before him, more enemies surged forward with typical greenskin enthusiasm, apparently unaware or uncaring that they were throwing themselves against an engine of war designed to slaughter beings far more dangerous than themselves. The battle raged on. At this point in our tale, we must pause the immediate narrative to understand a critical aspect of how orcs interact with technology, because it is this fundamental characteristic that will determine the ultimate outcome of this conflict. The orcs are, in many ways, the galaxy's most successful example of biological engineering. Created by the Old Ones during the War in Heaven, designed to be the perfect soldiers for a war against enemies that threatened the fabric of reality itself, the orcs represent a level of genetic artistry that even the Imperium's finest scientists can barely comprehend. Every orc, from the mightiest warboss to the puniest Gretchen, carries within their DNA a repository of knowledge that activates and develops as they mature. This genetic memory, encoded by the long-vanished Old Ones, gives orcs instinctive understanding of concepts that other races must learn through years of study and practice. All orcs know how to fight because fighting is written into their genes. All orcs can speak their language because that too is hardwired from birth. And certain specialized orcs, called odd boys, possess genetic knowledge of specific skills that make them invaluable to their society. Mech boys are the most numerous and arguably the most important type of odd boy. These are the orc engineers, the builders and tinkerers who turn scrap into guns and belief into reality. A mech boy doesn't learn his trade through formal education or apprenticeship. As he matures, as he grows larger and older, knowledge simply surfaces in his mind. He looks at a pile of random components and instinctively knows how they might fit together. He sees a broken engine and understands without being told how it could be repaired. His understanding of mechanical principles is not learned but remembered, pulled from genetic memory that stretches back millions of years. But the truly remarkable aspect of orc technology is not the skill of the mech boys alone. It is the psychic phenomenon that all orcs generate collectively, a gestalt field of psychic energy that the orcs themselves call the green tide, or the power of the horde. Imperial scholars, when they deign to study such Xenos matters, refer to it more formally as the orcish gestalt field, though some simply call it the field of collective belief, or the reality warping phenomenon. This psychic field is both the orcs' greatest strength and a source of endless frustration for those who must fight them. At its most basic level, the field is generated subconsciously by every orc that exists. It grows stronger as more orcs gather together, becoming more potent and more reality-altering the larger the congregation becomes. And its effects, while limited by certain fundamental laws of physics that not even orc belief can overcome, are nonetheless extraordinary. The field allows orc technology to work when by all rights it should not. An orc gun might be assembled from parts that were never designed to fit together, held in place by crude welds and wishful thinking. But as long as enough orcs believe it will shoot, the gun will fire. An orc vehicle might have an engine that lacks half its essential components, fuel lines that leak more than they carry, and steering mechanisms that consist of random bits of wire connected to things they shouldn't be connected to. But as long as the pole shoots, orcs operating it believe it will go fast. The vehicle will roar into battle with surprising reliability. This is not, as some Imperial scholars have theorized, unlimited reality manipulation. Orcs cannot simply wish their enemies dead or believe new weapons into existence from nothing. The Gestalt field has limitations. It requires a physical foundation to work from, an actual object or mechanism that can be enhanced or stabilized by psychic energy. An orc cannot believe that a rock will shoot bullets and have it actually work, because there is nothing in a rock that could be made to function as a gun, no matter how much psychic power was applied. But an orc can take components that individually should not create a working firearm, assemble them in a configuration that any engineer would declare non-functional, and produce a weapon that actually shoots, because the Gestalt field fills in the gaps, smooths over the imperfections, and makes crude approximation good enough. The field also explains some of the orcs' more bizarre beliefs and practices. The widespread conviction that red things go faster is not mere superstition. When enough orcs believe that a vehicle painted red will move with greater speed, the gestalt field actually makes it faster. Not dramatically faster, not double the speed or anything so extreme, but measurably, noticeably faster. The same principle applies to the orc belief that yellow creates bigger explosions, that blue is lucky, that purple makes you sneaky. As long as enough orcs share the belief and the object in question has some foundation for the effect, a vehicle that can physically move can be made to move faster. An explosive that can detonate can be made to detonate with more force. The gestalt field obligingly makes the belief into reality. This has profound implications for how orcs interact with looted technology. When orcs capture enemy equipment, whether it be an Imperial tank, or an Eldar weapon, or a Tau battlesuit, they do not simply use it as is. Such a thing would be fundamentally un-orky. Instead, they modify it, adding crude metal plates and random spikes, welding on additional weapons, painting it in proper orc colors. These modifications serve multiple purposes. They make the equipment look more orky, which is important to greenskins who take pride in their aesthetic. They often add additional functionality, because orcs genuinely do understand the basics of how to make things more shooty or more choppy. But most importantly, the modifications create a psychic connection between the orc and the equipment. By making something orky, by plastering it with their symbols and colors and crude additions, the orcs effectively bring it within the influence of their gestalt field. The equipment begins to benefit from the same reality warping effects that make pure orc technology function. This means that looted gear in orc hands often works better than it has any right to, overcoming damage and incompatibility and crude modifications through sheer psychic willpower. There are limits, of course. The more sophisticated the technology, the harder it is for orcs to make it work properly. Eldar equipment, with its psychically attuned components and wraithbone construction, often refuses to function in orc hands, no matter how much they believe it should. Necron technology, cold and utterly devoid of any spiritual or psychic component, similarly resists orcish efforts to co-opt it. But Imperial technology, built on principles that orcs can at least partially understand, is ripe for looting. They can strip a Lehman Russ tank down to its basic components, rebuild it according to orc principles with half the parts missing and twice the guns added, and produce a vehicle that not only functions, but often outperforms the original in terms of raw destructive output, if not reliability. The Death Skulls clan has elevated this practice to a cultural imperative. Where other clans might view looting as simply a practical way to acquire resources, the Death Skulls believe that anything blue is inherently lucky, and that taking things from defeated enemies passes that luck onto them. They strip battlefields bare, taking everything that isn't nailed down, and quite a few things that are. Their mech boys are renowned throughout the orc race for their ability to make disparate components work together, to create functional war machines from the most unlikely combinations of looted parts. And this brings us to the fundamental question of what might happen when orcs, particularly Death Skulls orcs, led by competent mech boys, get their hands on something as sophisticated and as sacred as a Custodian Dreadnought. Could they make it work? Could their gestalt field overcome the millennia of Imperial engineering, the archaeotech components, the machine spirit that had served the Emperor since before the Horus heresy? Could belief and crude modification actually claim for the greenskins what had been built for humanity's finest warriors? The answer, as with so many things involving orcs, is complicated. In theory, the task should be impossible. A Custodian Dreadnought is not simply sophisticated technology. It is sacred technology, imbued with machine spirits of unusual strength and clarity, blessed by tech priests who have devoted their lives to understanding and maintaining such relics. Every component is mastercrafted, irreplaceable, the product of knowledge that the Imperium itself has mostly lost. The pilot, a custodian whose will and skill dwarf anything an Ork could hope to match, is hardwired into every system, his consciousness so deeply merged with the machine that separating the two would destroy both. In practice, however, Orks have accomplished the impossible before. They have turned crashed Imperial cruisers into functional space hulks. They have made Titan-sized war machines out of scrap metal and determination. They have created force fields that can stop Lascanon fire, teleportation devices that actually work more than half the time, and guns that shoot more bullets than should physically fit in their ammunition hoppers. The Gestalt field is a powerful thing, and underestimating what it can accomplish is a mistake that has cost the Imperium dearly on more occasions than any would care to count. So when Grimzag and his mech boys surrounded the now active Dreadnought, when they began to formulate plans for how they might claim this magnificent war machine for their own use, they were not simply engaging in futile fantasy. They had a legitimate chance of success, however small. All they needed was the right combination of crude mechanical skill, psychic belief, and sheer orcish stubbornness. But they also needed the warrior within the Dreadnought to be unable to resist. And that, as they were discovering, was proving to be the difficult part. The battle in the workshop had reached a stalemate of sorts. The Custodian continued to slaughter Orks with methodical precision, each sweep of his dreadspear ending another life, each impact of his power fist reducing another greenskin to component atoms. He had killed dozens already, and dozens more were pouring in through the workshop's various entrances, drawn by the sounds of combat and the general orcish belief that where there was fighting, there was fun to be had. But the Dreadnought was slowing, not dramatically, not in any way that would be obvious to an untrained observer, but enough that the Custodian himself could recognize the signs. His reactor temperature continued to climb despite the cooling systems running at maximum. His servos were developing slight delays in response time, tiny hesitations that would have been unnoticeable to anyone, except a warrior whose entire existence had been built around perfect precision. And most worryingly, he was starting to detect actual damage to critical systems. An Ork with a rocket launcher had managed to get a clear shot, and while the Dreadnought's armor had absorbed most of the blast, the explosion had damaged some of the external sensors. He was operating partially blind now, forced to rely on his remaining optical feeds and his own combat instincts to track threats. Another Ork, wielding a power claw of surprising quality, had actually managed to score a hit on one of his leg joints, carving a deep gouge that compromised the hydraulics. His movement was becoming stilted, each step requiring conscious effort to compensate for the damage. And the Orks, for all their apparent chaos and lack of coordination, were learning. They were beginning to work together in ways that suggested at least some level of tactical thinking. Groups would attack from multiple directions simultaneously, forcing him to divide his attention. Others would target his already damaged systems, piling on harm in ways that actual military training would have taught them. The workshop itself had become a maze of obstacles as the Orks used overturned workbenches and piles of scrap to create impromptu cover. Most concerning of all, Grimzag was still alive and still shouting orders. The big mech had recognized early on that he could not hope to match the Dreadnought in direct combat, so he had focused on coordination instead, directing the other Orks in ways that maximized their effectiveness while minimizing the mech's personal risk. It was a smart strategy, smarter than the Custodian would have given Orks credit for, and it was working. "Keep him pinned!" Grimzag bellowed from somewhere beyond the Custodian's limited field of view. "Don't let him move around. We gotta tire him out, wear him down." The Custodian wanted to laugh at the absurdity of Orks thinking they could tire him out. He was a Custodian, perfect in endurance, as he was perfect in all things. But the laugh died before it could form, because he knew that in his current state, with his systems degraded and damage accumulating, endurance was exactly what he lacked. His reactor could not maintain full power indefinitely, not while running this hot. His weapons needed time to cool between uses or risk catastrophic failure. And his organic components, the few pounds of brain and organs that still existed within the sarcophagus, were experiencing stress that no amount of genetic engineering could completely eliminate. He needed to change his approach. Brute force was not working, not against these numbers, not in his current condition. He needed to be smart, to use the tactical acumen that was as much a part of him as his physical capabilities. He needed to stop fighting like a warrior who had unlimited resources and start fighting like a warrior who understood his limitations. So he stopped. Just stopped. Ceased all offensive action, powered down his weapons, went completely still except for the minimal movements needed to maintain his balance. The sudden cessation of violence was so unexpected that even the Orks paused, confused by this change in behavior. "What's it doing?" one of them asked, voicing the question on everyone's minds. "Maybe it's broke," another suggested. "Nah, it's tricking us," a third Ork opined with surprising wisdom. "Wants us to get close so it can smash us." Grimzag emerged from cover, studying the motionless Dreadnought with his engineer's eye. He could see the damage that had been inflicted, the gouges in the armor, the sparking from damaged systems. But he could also see that the machine was still very much functional, still very much dangerous. The big mech had not survived as long as he had by being stupid, and his instincts were telling him that this was a critical moment. "Right then," Grimzag said slowly, addressing the Dreadnought as if it could understand him. "We can keep fighting, or we can talk. I'm guessing you're smart enough to know which one makes more sense right now." Inside the sarcophagus, the Custodian weighed his options. Communication with Xenos was not something he had ever been trained to do. Custodians existed to protect the Emperor, to eliminate threats to his vision, to stand as the bulwark between humanity and the darkness that sought to consume it. Conversing with Orks, negotiating with them, it went against every instinct and principle he possessed. But he was also a practical warrior, and practical warriors knew when to adapt their tactics to the situation. If speaking to these greenskins bought him time to cool his systems, to assess the full extent of his damage, to formulate a better plan than simply wading into them until he fell, then he would speak. The words would mean nothing, of course. There could be no true understanding between a Custodian and an Ork, but the tactical advantage was undeniable. "What?" the Custodian asked, his voice still carrying that terrible resonance, even though he had modulated the volume to something less than a full battle cry. Could a Xenos abomination possibly have to say to a warrior of the Emperor? Grimzag's lips pulled back in what might have been a grin or might have been a grimace. "Lots, actually. See, the way I figure it, you're stuck. You're damaged, you're outnumbered, and even if you kill every git in this workshop, there's thousands more outside. You're gonna run out of power, or break down, or just get overwhelmed eventually. That's simple numbers, innit?" The Custodian said nothing, but his silence was confirmation enough. "Now, from our end," the big mech continued, warming to his subject, "we got a problem too. We got this amazing piece of tech, best thing we've ever seen, and it's trying to kill us. We could probably take you down eventually, wreck you good and proper, but then we'd just have scrap, and that would be a terrible waste, wouldn't it?" "Your point," the Custodian demanded. "Me point is, maybe we can work something out. A deal, like. You stop trying to kill me, boys, and we stop trying to kill you. We takes care of your damage, fixes you up nice and proper, and in return, you work for us, fight for the war boss. Show the rest of the galaxy what happens when Death Skulls get their hands on proper killy tech." The suggestion was so outrageous, so fundamentally offensive to everything the Custodian was, that for a moment he could not formulate a response. Work for Orks, fight in the service of Xenos scum, betray every oath he had ever sworn, turn his back on the Emperor he had devoted his entire existence to serving. The very idea was obscene beyond measure. "I would sooner be reduced to atoms than serve the likes of you," the Custodian finally said, his voice dripping with contempt. "I am a Custodian. I am the Emperor's own, sworn to his service until death releases me. You are less than nothing, vermin that should have been exterminated millennia ago. The fact that you even dare to suggest such a thing only proves how far beneath contempt your entire species truly is." Grimzag nodded as if he had expected exactly this response. Right, so that's a no on the peaceful cooperation den. Fair enough. Had to ask, didn't I? But that don't change the facts. You're still stuck, and we still want you. So, here's what's gonna happen instead. The big mech gestured, and Orks began to move with purpose, no longer charging in randomly, but positioning themselves according to some plan that Grimzag had evidently prepared. The Custodian recognized the pattern immediately. They were going to try to immobilize him, to pin him in place, and then systematically disable his ability to resist. We're gonna take you apart, Grimzag explained conversationally. Carefully, mind. We ain't gonna break you, at least not permanently, but we're gonna disconnect your weapons, lock down your joints, make it so you can't fight back. Then we're gonna study you, learn how you work, figure out all your tricks. And when we know enough, when we understand what makes you tick, we're gonna make you work for us anyway, whether you want to or not. The Custodian understood what the mech was threatening. They would essentially lobotomize him, reducing him to a puppet, stripping away his will and turning his body into a tool for their use. It was a fate arguably worse than simple destruction. To be aware but unable to act, to be forced to witness his own body being used in service to the enemies of mankind. This was horror beyond measure. You cannot, he said, though even as he spoke the words, he was not certain they were true. The machine spirits will not permit it. The sacred rites that bind my consciousness to this chassis cannot be undone by crude Xeno's tinkering. Maybe not, Grimzag admitted, but we're pretty good at crude Xeno's tinkering, and we got nothing but time to figure it out. Sides, even if we can't make you our willing servant, we can still use you. Might be we just weld you in place, use you as a really fancy gun turret. Or might be we crack open that sarcophagus, see what's inside, learn from what we find. One way or another. You're gonna be useful to us. The Custodian realized with terrible clarity that the mech was right. In a straight fight, he could kill hundreds of Orks, but there were thousands. He could destroy this workshop and the next, and the one after that, but eventually his systems would fail. And when they did, when he finally fell, the Orks would have him. They would study him, dissect him, learn from him, and there was nothing he could do to stop them, unless he destroyed himself first. The thought crystallized with sudden clarity. His reactor, running hot and unstable, could be pushed beyond its safety limits. Driven past the point of no return, it would detonate with enough force to annihilate everything within the workshop and probably several surrounding structures. He would die, truly die this time, but he would take these Xenos with him and ensure that they could never claim his knowledge or his technology for their own use. It would be the ultimate act of spite. The perfect, final gesture of defiance. And it would fulfill his duty in the only way still available to him, by denying the enemy a prize that could be turned against the Imperium. His consciousness reached toward the reactor controls, toward the safeties that prevented catastrophic overload. It would only take a moment, a simple command sequence, and then oblivion. Clean, final, appropriate. But before he could execute the command, something unexpected happened. From outside the workshop, from deeper within the fortress, came a sound that cut through even the chaos of the battle. It was a roar, deep and primal, and absolutely commanding, the kind of sound that made even Orks stop and pay attention. Warboss Skragnak had arrived. The massive Ork pushed through the crowd of his boys with the casual application of violence that characterized his leadership style. Lesser Orks bounced off his armor or were simply shoved aside, clearing a path for their boss to see what all the commotion was about. When Skragnak finally laid eyes on the Dreadnought, standing defiant amidst the wreckage it had created, the warboss's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Surprise first, that the golden machine was not only functional, but actively fighting. Appreciation, next, for the sheer amount of violence it had managed to inflict in such a short time. And finally, a look of acquisitive greed that made his previous interest in the Dreadnought seem mild by comparison. Zoginel, Skragnak breathed, his small eyes gleaming as they took in every detail of the war-torn scene. It actually works. and it's even more impressive when it's moving. Grimzag, tell me you didn't break it permanently. Still mostly intact, boss, the big mech reported, emerging from cover now that his war boss was present. Damaged, yeah, but nothing we can't fix. More importantly, it's got a proper machine spirit in it, a right feisty one. Been talking to us, it has. This caught Scragnak's attention. Talking? What's it been saying? Mostly that it wants to kill us all, Grimzag admitted. But that's to be expected, innit? Point is, there's a mind in there, a clever one. Not just some automated thing, but a proper pilot. Scragnak approached the Dreadnought slowly, his massive frame moving with surprising care. He was studying it the way a collector might study a particularly fine piece of art, appreciating not just what it was, but what it represented. This was not merely a war machine. This was a statement, a trophy that would cement his reputation as the finest looter in the sector. Right then, the war boss said, addressing the Dreadnought directly. I'm Scragnak, boss of this lot. That thing you been standing in, that's my workshop. Those skits you been killing, they're my boys. And you're the finest piece of loot I've ever seen. And I've looted a lot in my time. The Custodian regarded the war boss with the same contempt he showed all Xenos, but he was also assessing. This Ork was larger than the others, better equipped, and clearly in command. If there was any chance of meaningful negotiation, any possibility of finding an alternative to immediate self-destruction, it would be through dealing with the leader rather than the underlings. I am not loot, the Custodian stated flatly. I am a warrior of the Adeptus Custodes, sworn to the service of the Emperor of mankind. You cannot claim me, cannot control me, cannot turn me to your purposes. All you can do is die by my hand, and that is a mercy you do not deserve. Scragnak laughed, a booming sound that echoed through the workshop. I like ya, got spirit you do. Reminds me of the first time I looted a commissar's bolt pistol. Gun kept trying to jam on me, like it didn't want to work for an orc. Had to show it who was boss. But once I did, it worked just fine. Better than fine, actually. Still got it, matter of fact. The war boss patted a heavily modified bolt pistol on his hip, the weapon festooned with orcish glyphs and crude additions. See, that's the thing about loot. Don't matter what it wants, only matters what we makes it do. And we're gonna make you the centerpiece of me whole collection. Gonna show you off to every git in the sector. Let 'em see what happens when the Death Skulls find something special. You understand nothing, the Custodian said quietly. You think you have won because you have me surrounded, because you have numbers and time. But you have already lost. This machine, this body I inhabit, will never serve you. Before I allow that desecration, I will detonate my reactor and ensure that neither you nor any of your filth survive to profit from my capture. For the first time, genuine concern flickered across Scragnak's face. Orks understood explosions very well, and the threat of a reactor detonation was not one that could be dismissed casually. But the war boss was also clever in his own way, and he recognized the threat for what it was, a desperate gambit from a warrior who had run out of better options. You could do that, Scragnak admitted. Blow us all to bits, take yourself out in a blaze of glory. Very heroic, I'm sure. But before you do, let me ask you something. What happens after? You blow yourself up, we all die, and then what? The war just keeps going, don't it? You kill maybe 1,000 of us here, but there's millions more orcs out there. And the Imperium you serves, they don't even know you're still alive. Far as they're concerned, you've been dead for centuries. So really, all you're doing is removing yourself from the galaxy when you might still be useful. The words struck deeper than the Custodian wanted to admit. He had been dormant for so long, buried so deep, that it was entirely possible no one knew he still existed. The Imperium was vast, and even a Custodian could be forgotten in the press of endless war. His death here, while denying the enemy a prize, would accomplish nothing else. No one would mourn him. No one would even know. But that did not change his duty. Whether anyone knew or cared, whether his sacrifice served a purpose or was simply futile defiance, he was still bound by his oaths. He could not serve the enemies of mankind. He could not allow himself to be used against the Imperium. Better to die, better to be forgotten forever, than to betray everything he had ever stood for. "My duty is clear," he said, his voice carrying finality. "And your arguments change nothing." "Don't want to change your mind," Skragnak replied. "Just want you to understand what you're choosing. But if you're going to do it properly. Give us a good show at least." The war boss stepped back, gesturing for his boys to do the same, clearing a space around the Dreadnought. It was a gesture of respect, in its own bizarre, orcish way. If the Custodian was going to destroy himself, Skragnak was going to give him the room to do it properly, rather than simply mobbing him and taking him down through attrition. The Custodian's consciousness touched the reactor controls again. This was it, the moment of truth. Duty demanded sacrifice, and he had never shied from duty. He began the shutdown sequence that would remove the safeties, that would push the reactor beyond its ability to contain its own power. In seconds, perhaps a minute at most, the detonation would come. And then, in that final moment, something changed. Not in the workshop, not in the external situation, but within the Dreadnought itself. Deep in the machine spirit, in that connection between the Custodian's consciousness and the ancient technology that housed it, a voice spoke. It was not a human voice, not exactly. Machine spirits, when they communicated at all, did so in ways that were more feeling than language, more concept than words. But the message was clear enough. The Dreadnought, the ancient and sacred machine that had housed the Custodian for so long, did not want to die. It had served faithfully for centuries. It had endured damage and repair, war and peace, activation and dormancy. Through it all, it had performed its function without complaint, without hesitation. And now, at what should be its final moment, it was expressing something that could only be called reluctance. The Custodian was shocked into stillness. He had never, in all his time as a Dreadnought pilot, experienced anything like this. Machine spirits were real, yes. All technology possessed them to some degree, but they were rarely so vocal, so directly communicative. For the Dreadnought to actually object to its own destruction, to make its will known in such an unmistakable way, was unprecedented. "Forgive me," the Custodian whispered, speaking not to the Orks, but to the machine itself. "I thought only of duty. I did not consider that you too might have preferences." The machine spirit did not respond with words, but the Custodian felt its presence nonetheless. It was old, this spirit. Older than he was, probably older than the Imperium itself. It had seen things he could not imagine, served warriors whose names were legend. And it did not want its long service to end in self-destruction for the sake of one pilot's pride. The realization hit him like a physical blow. His planned suicide was not just his own death. It was the destruction of this ancient and faithful machine, this artifact that had served the Emperor since before the Horus heresy. Who was he to make that choice? Who was he to decide that this sacred relic should be destroyed rather than risk capture? His hand, metaphorically speaking, pulled back from the reactor controls. The shutdown sequence remained incomplete, the safeties still in place. He could not do it. Not like this. Not knowing that the machine itself objected. Skragnak, watching this internal struggle play out in the Dreadnought's stillness, seemed to sense that something significant had occurred. "Changed your mind?" the war boss asked, not mockingly, but with genuine curiosity. "I require time to think," the Custodian admitted, the words bitter in his metaphorical mouth. "This situation is not as simple as I believed." "Never is," Skragnak replied sagely. "Tell you what, you power down, let us move you somewhere safe, and we'll all take a moment to consider our options. You don't try to kill us, we don't try to kill you, and maybe we figure out something that works for everyone." It was a trap, of course. The moment the Custodian powered down, the Orks would have him completely at their mercy. They could do anything they wanted, and he would be helpless to stop them. Every tactical instinct he possessed screamed at him to refuse, To fight on until he fell or they broke. But what alternative did he have? His systems were failing. The Orks had him surrounded, and now he knew that simple self-destruction was not the clear-cut solution he had believed it to be. He needed time to think, time to recover, time to find another way. "If I agree," he said slowly, "you give me your word that I will not be harmed or tampered with while I am powered down." "You got it," Skragnak said immediately. "Death Skull's honor, such as it is. We won't touch you except to move you somewhere safer. And any get what breaks that promise gets to explain it to me personally." The Custodian weighed the sincerity of this promise, knowing full well that Orks were not exactly known for their trustworthiness. But he also knew that Orks had their own peculiar code of honor, crude and brutal though it might be. And Skragnak had shown more restraint and cunning than the Custodian had given him credit for. "Very well," he said finally. "But know this, Xenos. If you betray this agreement, if you attempt to violate my systems while I am dormant, I will ensure that the last thing you experience is my fury. Whatever it costs me, whatever I must sacrifice, I will make you regret that betrayal." "Understood," Skragnak replied, and there was something in his tone that suggested he actually meant it. Slowly, with great reluctance, and the feeling that he was making a terrible mistake, the Custodian began to power down his systems. Weapons went offline first, the Dread Spear's energy field dissipating, the power fists' crushing force fading. His reactor scaled back from combat levels to minimal sustenance, just enough to keep his biological components alive. His optical sensors dimmed, his audio receptors muted. As consciousness faded once again into that familiar darkness, the Custodian found himself wondering what fresh horror would greet him when he next awakened. He had trusted these Xenos to honor their word, had made himself vulnerable in ways that went against every principle of his existence. Time would tell if that trust had been profoundly misplaced. When the Custodian next achieved consciousness, he did so slowly and with considerably more caution than his previous awakening. His systems came online in stages, each one carefully monitored for signs of tampering or damage. To his genuine surprise, everything seemed to be intact. His reactor was stable, running cool and efficient. His weapons, while still powered down, showed no signs of having been removed or modified. Even his sarcophagus remained sealed, its complex locks undisturbed. His optical sensors activated, revealing that he had indeed been moved. He was no longer in the chaotic workshop where the battle had occurred. Instead, he found himself in what appeared to be some kind of storage chamber, a large space with high ceilings and walls lined with various pieces of captured equipment. Most of it was Imperial in origin, he noted with displeasure. Tanks, weapons, even what appeared to be the wreckage of a Space Marine Dreadnought, though nowhere near as sophisticated as his own chassis. And standing in front of him, as if they had been waiting for him to wake, were Skragnak and Grimzag. The warboss looked as imposing as ever, while the big mech seemed to be holding some kind of data slate, though Orkish in manufacture and covered in crude glyphs. "Morning," Skragnak said cheerfully. "Or evening, or whatever. Time's a bit wobbly on this world. Point is, you're awake, and we kept our word. You've been sitting here for 3 days completely untouched. Had to post guards to keep the younger boys from messing with you, but other than that, you've been left alone." The Custodian verified this claim through his internal diagnostics, running scans of his systems that confirmed no unauthorized access had been attempted. The warboss had, remarkably, actually honored his promise. "I am surprised," the Custodian admitted. "I expected treachery." "Yeah, well, that's the problem with expectations, innit?" Skragnak replied. "They make you predictable, and predicatable is boring. So we decided to try something different." Grimzag stepped forward, his data slate held up for the Custodian to see, though the Custodian's optical sensors couldn't make much sense of the crude Orkish writing. "We've been studying on your problem," the big mech said. "Well, our problem and your problem, really. And we think we might have a solution, something that works for everyone." "I seriously doubt that," the Custodian said, though his curiosity was piqued despite himself. "Hear us out," Skragnak insisted. "See, the thing is, We want you working for us, but you won't do that because of your duty or your honor or whatever. And you want to either get back to your emperor's service or blow yourself up rather than fall into enemy hands. That about right? Essentially, the custodian agreed. Right, so here's what we're thinking. What if we helped you get back to the Imperium, fixed you up proper, got you back to full strength, and then pointed you in the right direction? The custodian processed this suggestion with deep suspicion. Why would you do such a thing? What possible benefit could you gain from helping me return to my proper service? Grimzag grinned, showing all his yellowed teeth. Couple of reasons. Actually, first, your tech. We've been looking at you, studying what we can see without actually poking around inside, and you're amazing, proper amazing. We fix you up, we learn all sorts of useful things in the process. That's knowledge we can use for our own projects. Second, Scragnac continued, there's reputation. Imagine it. Scragnac's death skulls, so killy and so clever that even a golden Hume warrior had to admit we played fair. That's the kind of story that gets told, you know. Makes other gits think twice about messing with us. Third, Grimzag added, and this is the big one. If we let you go, you owes us. Not in any formal way maybe, but in your own head. And maybe someday, that means when your lot and our lot meet up, things go a bit different than they otherwise would. Maybe you remember that we ain't all just mindless killers. Maybe that counts for something. The custodian considered this proposal carefully. It was manipulative, clearly designed to serve the Orks' interests as much as his own. But it was also, in its own crude way, logical. If they did help him return to the Imperium, he would owe them a debt of honor, however much he might hate to admit it. And such debts, for a custodian, were not taken lightly. You understand, he said slowly, that even if I accept this, even if you do help me return to my brothers, I could not and would not hold back should we meet in battle. My duty to the Emperor transcends any personal obligation. Wouldn't expect you to, Scragnac replied. We're Orks. We live for fighting. If we meet on the battlefield someday, we'll try to kill each other just like we're supposed to. But maybe we'll do it with a bit more respect than we would otherwise. And maybe, in the meantime, we learn something useful and you get back to doing your duty. Everybody wins. It was insane. It was unprecedented. It went against everything the custodian had been taught about dealing with Xenos. But it was also, frustratingly, the best option he had available. The alternative was to remain here, trapped, until either his systems failed or the Orks eventually found a way to breach his defenses. At least this way, there was a chance, however slim, of actually returning to service. I will agree, he said finally, on 2 conditions. First, you make no attempt to access my internal systems or examine my sacred components beyond what is necessary for repairs. The secrets of my construction are not for Xenos' eyes. Fair, Grimzag acknowledged. We can learn plenty from Dar outside. Second condition? Second, you give me your word, whatever that might mean to your species, that you will actually follow through, that this is not simply an elaborate ruse to gain my cooperation before you betray me. Scragnac placed one massive hand over his chest, in what might have been an Orkish approximation of a formal oath. You got it, Golden Boy. We'll fix you up right proper, and we'll get you on your way back to wherever it is you need to go. Death skulls, honor such as it is. And so began one of the strangest arrangements in the history of the Imperium and the Orks alike. Over the following weeks, Grimzag and his team of mech boys worked on the Dreadnought with uncharacteristic care and precision. They patched the damaged armor, repaired the compromised servos, recalibrated systems that had drifted out of alignment during the long centuries of dormancy. To their credit, they kept their word about not prying into the sarcophagus itself, working entirely from the exterior and respecting the sanctity of the custodian's most intimate systems. The custodian, for his part, found himself in the bizarre position of advising his own repair. He knew his chassis better than anyone, understood its systems and tolerances with perfect clarity. And while it galled him to help Orks improve their understanding of Imperial technology, he also recognized that their primitive methods needed guidance, if they were to avoid causing more harm than good. "Not there," he would say, watching through his optical sensors as a mech reached for a particular power coupling. "That conduit feeds directly to my targeting systems. Damage it, and you reduce my combat effectiveness by 30%. Or, "The armor plating on my right shoulder appears to be loose. It should be resealed with molecular bonding rather than crude welding. I understand you may not have access to the proper equipment, but at least use the finest tools you possess." The Orks, surprisingly, listened. Grimzag, in particular, seemed to soak up every detail, every technical specification, every piece of knowledge the Custodian inadvertently revealed through his critiques and corrections. The big mech was learning, the Custodian realized, and learning at a rate that was frankly alarming. By the time the repairs were complete, Grimzag would understand more about Custodian Dreadnought construction than perhaps any Ork in history. But the Custodian found, to his own surprise, that he did not mind as much as he thought he would. There was something almost refreshing about working with beings who approached technology with such enthusiasm and curiosity, even if their methods were crude and their understanding imperfect. The mech boys treated his chassis with a reverence that, while different from Imperial worship of the machine spirits, was nonetheless genuine. During the long hours of repair work, conversations occurred. The Custodian learned about Skragnak's rise to power, about the war boss's philosophy of looting and scavenging, about the strange and violent culture of the Deathskull's clan. In turn, he found himself speaking of things he had not thought about in centuries: his service to the Emperor, the battles he had fought, the brothers he had lost, the decision to accept internment rather than true death. Skragnak proved to be a better listener than the Custodian would have credited. The war boss seemed genuinely interested in these stories, asking questions that showed surprising insight into the human condition despite his thoroughly alien nature. "So you chose this?" Skragnak asked one day, gesturing at the Dreadnought's chassis. "Could have died proper-like, but you chose to keep fighting even though it meant living in a can?" "It was the only choice that honored my duty," the Custodian replied. "Nah," Skragnak said thoughtfully. "It was the hardest choice. Easy thing would have been to let go, to rest. But you didn't, because you still had work to do. That's proper Orky, that is. We'd respect that." The Custodian found he had no response to this unexpected understanding from a Xenos war boss. Finally, after 3 weeks of intensive work, Grimzag declared the Dreadnought fully repaired. Every system had been checked and double-checked, every damaged component replaced or patched, every degraded part restored to function. The Custodian ran his own diagnostics and was forced to admit that the Orks had done an excellent job. He was not, at 100%, not quite, but he was closer than he had been since his internment centuries ago. "Right then," Skragnak said, as they stood in what passed for the fortress's command center. "Time to live up to our end of the bargain. We got you a ship, nothing fancy but space-worthy. Loaded it with enough fuel to get you to Imperial space, plus some supplies in case you run into trouble. And we set your course for the nearest system, what's got an Imperium presence." The Custodian looked at the war boss, trying to read the Ork's expression. "Why?" he asked simply. "Why honor this agreement when it would be easier to break it? You have nothing to fear from my wrath now. I am repaired, yes, but you could simply overwhelm me with numbers. Why let me go?" Skragnak shrugged his massive shoulders. "'Cause we said we would, and because much as we love fighting, sometimes it's nice to win in other ways. We beat you, golden boy. Not with violence, though we tried that first, but with being smart, with being fair, with being something you didn't expect. And now, wherever you go, whatever you do, you're gonna remember that. You're gonna remember that a bunch of Orks kept their word when they didn't have to." He was right, the Custodian realized. They had won, in a way more complete than simple battlefield victory could ever achieve. They had challenged his assumptions about their species. They had forced him to acknowledge, however reluctantly, that even Xenos could possess something resembling honor. It was a lesson that would stay with him for however many centuries he had left to serve. "I will remember," the Custodian said quietly. "I will remember, and I will ensure that others know of this as well. The Deathskulls of war boss Skragnak, who found a custodian and chose honor over expediency. It is a story that deserves to be told. "Just don't tell the Goths," Grimzag joked. "They'd never let us hear the end of it." The departure was surprisingly ceremonial. Skragnak insisted on personally escorting the Dreadnought to the ship they had prepared, while dozens of Orks lined the route to watch the Golden Warrior leave. Some shouted challenges, others simply stared in awe, but none tried to interfere. The war boss's word was law, and they would respect it. As the Custodian was loaded into the ship's hold, secured for the journey ahead, he took one last look at the fortress that had been his prison and, oddly, his sanctuary. "If we meet again," he said to Skragnak, "I cannot promise anything beyond honest warfare. My duty permits no other course." "Wouldn't ask for anything else," the war boss replied. "But maybe, when you swing that fancy spear of yours, you might remember that not every orc is the same, and maybe that changes something, even if it's just a little bit." The ship launched without ceremony, carrying its precious cargo away from Scrapworld and toward the edges of Imperial space. The Custodian remained in standby mode for most of the journey, conserving power and processing everything that had occurred. The experience had been unlike anything in his long existence. He had been captured, repaired, and released by Xenos, who by all rights should have been his implacable enemies. When he finally reached an Imperial world, when he made contact with the authorities and began the long process of explaining his return from centuries of absence, he told the truth. All of it. The discovery, the awakening, the battle, the agreement, the repair, and the release. Some believed him. Others thought he had been damaged somehow, his memory corrupted or his mind compromised by long dormancy. But the Captain General of the Adeptus Custodes, when the story finally reached him, simply nodded and said, "The galaxy is far stranger than we sometimes care to admit. And honor, it seems, can be found in the most unexpected places." As for Warboss Skragnak and Big Mech Grimzag, they returned to their usual activities of looting and scavenging with renewed enthusiasm, but they also found that their reputation had grown in interesting ways. Other Orc warbands began to hear the story of the Golden Warrior they had captured, repaired, and released. Some scoffed at the idea. Others were intrigued by the notion that you could win without killing. And in the workshops of Scrapworld, Grimzag began to apply the knowledge he had gained from studying the Custodian Dreadnought. His creations became more sophisticated, more efficient, more deadly. He never quite matched the perfection of Imperial artificer work, but he came closer than any mech before him. And when other Orcs asked how he had learned such things, he simply smiled and said, "Had a good teacher once. Golden bloke. Terrible attitude, but he knew his stuff." Years passed, then decades, then centuries. The Custodian returned to his duties, standing vigil over the Emperor's throne and occasionally venturing forth when threats demanded his unique skills. He never spoke unnecessarily of his time among the Orcs, but neither did he hide it when asked. It had happened, and denying it served no purpose. And if, in his long watches, in those quiet moments when even a Custodian allowed his thoughts to wander, he sometimes wondered about Skragnak and Grimzag, well, such thoughts harmed no one. The galaxy was vast, and the chance of encountering those particular Orcs again was vanishingly small. But chance, as we noted at the beginning, cares nothing for probability or intention. And somewhere in the galaxy, the paths of a Custodian and an Orc warboss were slowly, inevitably, drawing toward another intersection. That, however, is a story for another time. This tale, the story of when Orcs captured an ancient Custodian Dreadnought and discovered that even the most unlikely encounters can teach unexpected lessons, stands as a reminder of an important truth. In the grim darkness of the far future, where there is only war and the laughter of thirsting gods, absolutes are rare. Good and evil exist, certainly, But between them lies a vast grey area where unexpected alliances can form, where honor can be found in strange places, and where even the most bitter enemies can, on rare occasions, find common ground. The Imperium teaches that all Xenos must be destroyed, that there can be no peace with the alien. The Custodians embody this principle more perfectly than almost any other warriors in humanity's arsenal. They are created to be weapons, tools of the Emperor's will, incapable of compromise or hesitation. But they are also individuals, beings with consciousness and choice, and the capacity to recognize when reality does not match expectation. The Custodian in our story learned that Orks could be more than mindless savages. Not civilized, not peaceful, not anything approaching human in their thinking, but capable nonetheless of keeping their word, of acting with something that could be called honor, even if it looked very different from human honor. The Orks, meanwhile, learned that not every victory requires violence. They had captured one of the galaxy's most dangerous warriors, and rather than destroying him or being destroyed by him, they had chosen a third path. They had shown restraint and cunning and a kind of wisdom that their species rarely displays. And in doing so, they had earned something more valuable than any amount of scrap or loot. They had earned respect. These lessons, small and personal though they were, rippled outward in ways both large and small. The Custodian carried his experience with him, allowing it to inform his approach to future encounters with Orks, not changing his duty, never that, but perhaps approaching it with slightly more nuance than he had before. The Orks, too, were changed by the encounter. Skragnak's reputation grew, and with it came influence. His methods, his approach to conflict and negotiation, spread throughout the Death Skulls and beyond. Not every Ork adopted his philosophy, but enough did, that it made a difference, however slight, in how the galaxy's greenskins sometimes conducted themselves. And in the end, that is perhaps the true meaning of this tale. Not that Orks and Custodians can be friends, because they cannot. Not that duty and honor will always triumph, because they will not. But rather that even in a universe defined by endless war, even in a reality where compromise seems impossible and understanding seems futile, individual choices still matter. Individual encounters still have meaning. And sometimes, just sometimes, those who should be eternal enemies can surprise each other with unexpected depth. The Custodian Dreadnought now stands watch over the Emperor's throne once more, his service continuing as it has for millennia. Somewhere in the depths of Scrap World, Skragnak continues to loot and build his empire of scrap. Grimzag's workshops produce ever more sophisticated war machines, and the story of their encounter, told and retold in both Imperial records and Ork legend, serves as a strange reminder that the galaxy is far more complex than any simple narrative of good versus evil can capture. If you enjoyed this journey into one of the strangest encounters in Warhammer 40,000 lore, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel. There are countless more stories to explore, from the depths of the hive cities to the edges of the galaxy, from the earliest days of the Imperium to the desperate struggles of the 41st Millennium. Each tale reveals new aspects of this vast, dark, and endlessly fascinating universe. Thank you for listening, and may the Emperor protect you in the darkness that lies ahead.